Welcome everyone to WA Museum. It's a pleasure to see you all here tonight for Festival of Urbanism Perth. This is the second year that we've been involved in the Festival of Urbanism initiative, which is organised by the Henry Halloran Trust, which is based at the University of Sydney. And I'd like to welcome Professor Nicole Guerin from the Henry Halloran Trust at the University of Sydney to say a few words about the Festival of Urbanism.
Thanks, Paul, and thanks everybody for coming. As Paul said, I'm Nicole Guerin, Professor of Urban and Regional Planning at the University of Sydney and Director of the Henry Halloran Research Trust. But before I just tell you a few words about the Research Trust and the Festival of Urbanism, I want to acknowledge, of course, that we are here on the beautiful lands of the Whadjuk Noongar people. It's been their country for more than 45,000 years, and I pay my respects to the elders, past, present and emerging, and my deep, deep, deep gratitude for the custodianship and for the wisdom that those communities have shown in caring for country. And can I also take a moment to recognise, of course, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, which is where I have the privilege of living and working in Sydney. The Henry Halloran Research Trust is philanthropically funded by a bequest, which makes us entirely independent. We're based at the University of Sydney, but our mission is twofold. One is to bring together the various bodies of knowledge that are within our university and other universities. We began in urban and regional planning and architecture and design, but of course universities bring together medicine, politics, geography, arts, science, you name it. And the mission of the Henry Halloran Research Trust is to draw on those different bodies of knowledge and to throw them at the challenges and opportunities that face our cities and regions. And to do that in dialogue with decision makers, with community leaders, with industry, and with the wider public. So a really big mission of the Henry Halloran Research Trust, and we've only been in operation for a decade, but a really big mission is to break out of the university and to support evidence-informed dialogue between researchers, but also engaging with industry, with political leaders, with people in government, and most importantly, the wider public. And our annual Festival of Urbanism is the flagship event for doing that. It's been in Sydney for nearly a decade now. Last year, we took it beyond our partner, University Monash in Melbourne, and our first Festival of Urbanism Australia event was here in Perth last year, and so it's such a thrill to be here this year. Our theme for the festival this year is public urbanism, and it's something that I feel very passionately about. As a question that's big on my mind is whether the public interest in our cities and our regions and decisions about them has been overtaken by private interests. But when we come to a fabulous public institution like the Western Australian Museum, we look at the fabulous public realm that surrounds us. We check out the great exhibition as part of Perth Design Week, and we see the wonderful examples of public architecture and public urban design. And of course, we're here today with the Public Policy Institute led by Professor Paul McGinn. It gives me great hope, actually, that public cities and public discourse are alive and well. So I'm very much looking forward to this panel tonight. I'm looking forward to the conversation that it's going to spark both across our wonderful speakers and of course with you afterwards at the reception. So with that, I'll hand you back to Paul.
Thanks, Nicole. So if you've read the title for the our event tonight, I have a thing about putting the word sub in brackets in front of everything. So we're actually, the title for our event is Public Suburbanisms, and that comes from the research that I've been doing, looking at I suppose, the symbiotic relationship between urban spaces and suburban spaces, and arguing that you can't have an urban space without the suburbs and vice versa. Basically, neither space can exist without one another. And in putting this together, this event together, we wanted and speaking with Nicole, I wanted to branch out a little bit, and I was really fortunate to meet with Sandy. And Sandy and I got chatting about things, and we came up with the idea around people, place, and power to kind of look at things. So we wanted to look at I suppose, the physical side of urbanisms and suburbanism, as well as the kind of the political, the social, and the cultural kind of dimensions of the thing as well. So for us at the Public Policy Institute, it's really good to be collaborating with Sandy and Perth Design Week, because that's part of our mission in, public engagement on policy issues that we're really interested in. So when it came to kind of crafting the panel, we had a really kind of good discussion around who could we get in the panel. So in case you don't know our esteemed panel here, I'm just going to do kind of quick introductions in alphabetical order. So, and you can raise your hand as I call out your name. Okay. So first we have Dimity Dennis. Okay, who works for Design for Reconciliation, so takes a really kind of interesting position and work in doing design and planning and architecture around a big question about kind of reconciliation. And I think, following from Nicole's comment, that's very important given that the lands that we're on here. Next, we have who have we got here? Oh, sorry, Peter Samidis from Hatch, and I've had a long relationship with Peter. When I was the director of the planning program at UWA, we would work with Hatch very closely on my students, and we worked on various master plans around Perth. So it's great to be to see Peter here as well. Next is Ray Heron, who I've also had some connections with through my role at UWA, and Ray's involvement on the Planning Institute of Australia through the Education Committee and so forth. So it's great to have Ray here as well. Anthony Duckworth-Smith, who is my colleague from UWA. So he's the token academic on the panel. Everybody, and he is a practitioner as well. So, but he's an academic, so it's great to have you here as well, Anthony. And then finally, we have Emma Snow from the Town Team Movement as well, which is fair to say, a kind of grassroots kind of practice approach to looking at space and place and design and planning and so forth. Okay, so the way this is going to work tonight, Sandy and I are going to play kind of question tennis. We're going to ask a question on this side, and then Sandy's going to ask a question to the panel. But to get them warmed up a little bit, and maybe a little bit provocative to kick things off. So just want to ask you all quickly to tell us, what's your favorite space or place in the world? So putting you right on the spot. So we'll start off with Peter, and we'll work across to me. Okay, so Peter, favorite place, space in the world, and just very quickly, why?
Okay, thank you. And that was a tough question. I'm glad that full disclosure, we actually did know that's coming, because that's a bit like saying, what's your favourite album out of your record collection? Can we have 20? But for me, I finally had to just pull them apart and think about emotionally which place I have the most joy in, and that's Liva Laukums in Riga, Vats Riga, which is a space that's about the size of Fed Square. It's 800 years old, so it's an old city. Laukums means that it's a field, originally a field, so it evolved over those centuries. It has green spaces within it. It's got stall spaces. It's got a bar. It's got exquisite edges, beautiful architecture, and great trading along the edges, including cultural uses. It is a joy to be within, and I could as happily have a beer in there as sit under a tree and do some drawing.
Emma?
I spent a lot of time thinking about this too, and I thought in the last year or so, where's really struck me, and that was a place that's called Absalon. Don't know if anyone's been there. It's in Copenhagen, and it's described as an extension of your living room. And so it used to be an old church, and the idea is that anybody can go there every night. They have a long table dinner there. If the weather's good, it moves out onto the street, and the median's just full of people eating and drinking. you can meet your neighbour there. You can, if you're a visitor, you can go and dine with people, and there's activities all day. Sometimes there's yoga, sometimes there's things for babies, sometimes there's film nights. Every single night they've had in the Great Hall, they've had their long table dinner though, that's their staple. So I really love that.
Thanks, Emma. Anthony.
So I think picking up on your theme, not necessarily favourite, but the most interesting space, and one that's probably relevant to Perth as well, was recently walking down the Venice Beach boardwalk in Los Angeles. And it's not a comfortable space. It's a space that is political. It has an energy to it, and it feels like you're part of something there. You're not just part of a relaxing recreation activity. There's an urgency, and there's things happening there, and there are very diverse people there, and it's a very simple space as well.
Timothy.
So mine's probably quite close to home. I love the Swan Valley. I love driving through the Swan Valley, sitting specifically at your harbour, the coffee shop, and looking out at the scenery there and just relaxing. Swan Valley would be for me.
And finally, Ray.
Yeah.
Favourite space.
Well, and again, I thought about this in the context of my favourite space now, because I do think it changes depending on where you're at in your life. And taking my granddaughter down to the McMillan Park, I think it's called, down in Vic Park, where they do the Sunday farmers market, and there's there's activities and that there, and you bump into people you know. So for me, it's that atmosphere and sense of connection.
Excellent, thanks.
Well, I think we got a head start here on our next question, which is what is your favourite place in Perth? So I think it's good to see that you've both said that your favourite places in the world are in Perth. But going back to the other panellists, what's your favourite spot in Perth? We'll reverse the order now. I'll start with Anthony.
I have so many. It's hard to pick one, actually. And when I think of place, I immediately jump to nature in Perth, and I think of natural environments, because those are the ones that we see. But when I move into urban places and we think about urbanism, and again, it's not the most favourite, it's the most interesting for me, is probably still Forest Place in the city. And I always think that is our prime central sort of locus for urbanism in Perth. So it's always good to observe what's happening in that place.
Emma?
Yeah, so when I was thinking about this question for Perth and for in the world, I realised I think it's places that give me a sense of hope. And so I find Coogee Common gives me a lot of hope, seeing an urban farm in a suburban area. I think, we're going to need more and more of that. And I just think it's such a fulfilling place to be.
Peter?
Mine's the green corridor between East Perth Cove and roughly up to the ABC. I love that because it's got fantastic serial image. In other words, you can walk through sequences, spaces. It's a bit like storyboarding an experience. You've got compression, you've got reveals, you've got shady areas, you have active edges, and it always feels safe as well. We used to have our office nearby. It's such a gorgeous place. I'd call it beautiful as well.
I think we're going to have to publish this list, Paul.
Yeah. Anybody else? Ray? Oh, well, you've said that you're a Perth spaces and opposed.
Well, I would just say that, as I sort of say, that there is the favourite space now, but then if I think back, like Market Street in Fremantle back in the day when it was, seeing the Tiranas doing the bog laps and all that, like in my early 20s, that was my favourite space. Versus, I don't know, when I had a young family, it was anywhere that had basically a family change room. So it tended to be more like the food court at the local shopping centre. So I just sort of think we need to acknowledge that in your different phases of life, those things are going to change.
Okay, so final warm-up question, right? And this is going to be the hardest one, I think. But we're here to ask some hard questions, I think. What's your least favourite space in Perth? And I'll start to give you a kind of a head. I'll be brave. I'll step forward. I've got two. So one is, and it's a contemporary one, is Bayswater New Train Station, because it's my local train station. I'm not a big fan. I'm not a big fan of it. in terms of, the scale of it and everything else. So that's the explanation. And then the other one is a fairly recent one, would be Yegan Square. And I had a colleague over here back in 2018 when the Planning Institute had their national conference here, and we were doing this little series of pod bites going around looking at Perth at different spaces. And for me, it was just the harshness, it was the greyness, the concrete, the lack of natural green, soft elements in the space. And that's why, to me, it didn't work. So that's my admission. I did say to Peter earlier on, and coming back to your reference about albums, I don't like the Beatles. So, and we were trying to highlight the point. Well, these are all very kind of subjective points about what is a good space and what's a bad space. So that's me softening you up so that you can get away with saying what you want now about your least favorite space. So you just have to say the space, and then we'll move into proper questions.
Paul, thank you so much for that wind up, because I love the Beatles. And I love them because they were creative. But least favourite space, look, those other spaces that I mentioned give you a warm hug. This one gives you a headbutt, and it's just that space in this complex, just downstairs, where we've got the black basalt rock. That used to be a gorgeous secret garden in there, inviting. It was enticing you to stay. Now it's telling you just move on. We don't want you here. That's my least favourite space.
Emma?
I don't know if it's really it's a place, but I'd say the Camfield, like that, do you know what I mean around Optus Stadium? I just think so big, so cold, so loud, so unwelcoming, no intimacy, no personality, makes me, if I got invited there, I'd do everything I could not to go.
Anthony?
I'll be taking my students to the convention centre next week, and that's it's a remarkable way to stunt a city, and it's addressing the river. So yeah, I mean, I know we've spoken about it a lot at the convention centre, but yeah, unfortunately, it really interrupts the city really poorly. So it's an urban design tragedy, I'm afraid.
Dimity?
I would have to say level 2 of Morley Galleria. Watching.
I support that statement.
Because that used to be my favourite shopping centre, and then slowly you see the signs that say coming soon, and then this way, and then go down, and yeah. So Morley Galleria.
And Ray, are you going to out-Trump all of us?
Well, no, well, it depends. I'm going to go with the opposite what you said in terms of, harsh and grey. I mean, Langley Park, to me, is the most, missing opportunity. And I know that there's grand plans around now, but it's, series 14.7. I would like to, if something could actually happen, but I think it's going to be, it needs to be something that is embracing and diverse as opposed to just trying to cover off one.
An urban surf park, for example.
Potentially.
Just as an example, as an idea.
And vicinity of a client, I'll introduce you to them and you can have a word.
Yeah, well, Anthony's colleague from Audric's written a book on all the proposals for Langley Park over the years. It's called Take Me to the River. So if anyone's interested in reading that, there's, I think, 100 years of proposals. But getting into our serious questions now, talking about spaces that are great and spaces that are not so great. How can public urban spaces be designed to foster a stronger sense of community and identity, especially in suburban areas where residents often feel disconnected from the city and from urban life? Peter?
Thank you, Sandy. Okay, that's a good question. I'll pick up the key words there, how to design. And really how to make a great space, particularly in terms of let's call it a square or something of that sort of place, an urban space. And I did make some notes, and it's simply because I think there are a lot of principles that we need to be thinking about, and I didn't want to be missing some of those. And this does eventually play back to Paul's comment about Yegan Square, because some of these, the absences of these happening in Yegan Square, I think underpin its failure. So we need to be thinking about things like, is the space at the confluence of movement paths? In other words, you can have people coming through. How many entry points? You've got a lot of entry points going in. Are you co-locating with any significant attractors that are going to be getting people in there? Is there a 24/7 presence in there? Do you have active edges around it? Are there levels keeping step with the floor plates? Or have you got activation that's actually a basement and it's not engaging, that's Yagan Square? What sort of serial image have you got coming into it? What sort of visual enclosure do you have around that space? Does it have a sense of place in there? Do you have any cultural markers? Is it of a human scale? Do you have shelter, shade? You're going to get wet or going to get burned? In fact, Yagan Square used to be called Melanoma Alley for a little while. Do you have stationary spaces where it's okay to sort of sit down somewhere? And then finally, this is what the landscape architects will finally come back to. Town square, okay, it's all about the paving. Yeah, paving and landscaping also. And then finally making it socially equitable for everybody to be in there. That just goes to show if you want to do a good space, there's a lot of things to think about. That's some of the things I would be thinking about designing a great space in suburbs.
I think we all need a copy of your list. Emma, what do you think? How do we foster a stronger sense of community with space?
I think it was about community and identity.
Yeah, community identity.
Yeah, I mean, I think from my experience, it has been about co-designing the space with people from that area. And I've been doing that a little bit for the Suburban Land Agency over in Canberra with PlaceLab. And what I've found in doing different projects is that once you really start refining, start really broad with what's important in the place, and that could be really anything, so we're not assuming anything. We get down to what's highly desirable, what's desirable, and what's undesirable. You get a really clear picture that's really specific to that place from those local people, and the result is different for different places, and you can see the better outcomes in the projects where you've done that. So I think that's where you get that local identity to run through that as well.
Yeah, and Town Team does an amazing job of working with the community.
Yeah, that's really at the heart of it, I think, at the beginning of the process and throughout it. Yeah.
Thanks, Emma. Anthony?
So I think, I would like to just reiterating that idea of community-led design. So important when you ask community what they value, the answers are sort of obvious and yet lacking in the spaces that are provided. So I think just asking that question and having that process is really important. And you said specifically suburban kind of context.
Especially in suburban areas.
Yeah, because I think, the suburbs, the patterns of suburbs and housing now has changed dramatically over the last 20 to 30 years. And people are increasingly atomised into the homes. They're driving into the homes. They're not necessarily engaging with their neighbours and having the sort of spaces that we used to have in suburbs. So I think contextually there's a real challenge with building community in those places. And then public spaces in suburbs are often hard to get to, hard to walk to. They're not shaded. So I think just getting some of those basics right is really important. The homes themselves and the way they interact with the street really doesn't allow those kind of casual and interactions to take place. So I think there's some real challenges just in the basic DNA of the suburb that's holding us back from forming strong communities in those areas sometimes.
Yeah, I think that's so true. Even going on a site visit for a different role a few weeks ago to one of the new suburban communities, and there's no front yard anymore. So while the front yard used to be a public space when I was a kid in the 70s and 80s, you played in the front yard and that was very much a public space. Now there is no front yard, there's no tree-lined streets to walk along to get to school. And
that interstitial space where you make decisions to engage with other people. We're really lacking those. You're in or you're out. And there's not that sort of medium space anymore in those areas.
Dimity, your thoughts?
Yeah, I think just building on what has already been said, I think talking with people is just the beginning and probably the end of everything as well. It should be like a cyclic kind of loop. Just defining what community and identity actually means to the local groups. I think maybe that's a step that's missed often. There's a process called co-production, which kind of summarises all of that, something that I use a lot with Design for Reconciliation, which is co-design, co-decision make, co-produce. Sorry, what was the last one? I wrote it down so I didn't forget. Co-deliver and co-evaluate. So making sure that every single process is done collectively with the community. So yeah, talking at every single point, and even at the initial stages of trying to develop what public space should be and what it should look like, and if it even should exist. Maybe it, is not meaningful and relevant to specific communities, but it is to others. So yeah, I think talking with people.
Ray?
Yeah, look, I hold a slightly different view, surprise. I mean, design is critically important, but in my mind, the best public spaces with identity evolve over time, and we, particularly in suburban context, now have this culture of instantaneous parks, which have been created for the community. And you don't actually know who the community of the future are going to be. The best example that I can think of was the work that we did for Monterio Quarter, which was the redevelopment of the Shenton Hospital site, where in the open space through there, one, it was about retention of key vegetation and landscape components, but then engaging with previous nurses who'd worked in the area, understanding some of the stories that pre-existed and incorporating that, but then also leaving some space and room for future things to be added as that community develops. And I think we sometimes forget that communities will change over time, and there has to be that ability to adapt with it, and we need to have some recognition of the past, both European and Indigenous, but then also provide, I know, like I think back to when my folks built a place down in Rockingham Park in the 70s, and it was in fact the neighbourhood who got together and planted the grass in the park. It wasn't delivered, and part of that was creating the community. And I know that some councils now, through Neighbourhood Watch, whatever, now host events to get to know your neighbours. And to me, both creating ownership of a space and then creating those connections with the neighbourhood, you know, that's the meaningful stuff. That's the stuff we need to focus on, in my view.
The people.
I should say if you've got some ideas in your head for questions, we're going to come to the audience and ask you for some questions opposed to the panel. But I just want to continue this line about community and identity. So Western Australia and Perth becoming an increasingly kind of multicultural, metropolitan region and state. It's actually WA is the most multicultural state relative to all the others. But I'm just curious to kind of, from a kind of public urbanism and suburbanism kind of perspective, you know, how can we make spaces so that they are more inclusive and more reflective of diversities, whether that's cultural diversity, sexual diversities, abilities and disabilities, for example. You know, what can we do to address diversity? And I'll just leave that question open rather than asking everybody. So if anybody wants to venture forward in a particular space.
Well, I think back to my work back in my city of Gosnell's days, and I remember the impact that putting in a universal swing into a playground and what that did in terms of the kids who were in wheelchairs being able to go on a swing and interact with the other kids. You know, sometimes there are really simple things that can be done which make, and again, I made reference before, having toilets or change rooms and things enables families to be able to go to a space. And there are some things which are universal, and some of it is about the language, making sure that you're not making people feel precluded, but you need to have that essential infrastructure which allows people to stay, and I think, as was mentioned before, shade, seating, all that stuff. But the biggest thing for me is thinking beyond your own circle, because especially in Gosnells, I mean, like, you know, you would have these people come in with these plans, and you're going, well, you're not talking about cappuccino sippers here. Like, these are, you know, good emu export drinkers. And so therefore how you perceive a space and how it should function is not going to be how they. And that's when I think speaking to people who actually occupy that area is obviously a key one.
Just to follow on that, so I go to the beach quite a lot, go surfing, and I'm always really, you know, shocked that, you know, accessibility issues for people with disabilities, for example, is really appalling. You know, no matter where you go in the world and you kind of look at beaches, and that's something that's kind of, you know, we're denying, a fairly significant and growing population, particularly those as we get older, access to beaches. So I'm just, your swing, I think, is a really good example of we can do that on land, but how do we do that at beach and in water environments as well? So just as a thought and thinking about other spaces.
I'd just pick up on one thing. What was hammered into me by a good colleague of mine was that it's not about disabled access, because it's not the access that's disabled, it's about universal access, because a woman with a pram is not disabled, but the issues of access are equal. Sorry.
Peter?
Just picking up on Ray's comment, as you were saying, you have to speak to the stakeholders, to the community, to understand what they need. And I think what that means also is that the ways in which we engage and the ways in which we experiment need to continue to evolve. We've been involved in a couple of town square projects for City of Stirling, one for Nollamara and one for Mirrabooka, and both of those involved engagement with a very diverse set of community members, and using just events to bring people to open conversations. The Nollamara one, the City of Stirling itself, actually, the credit to the city, it actually did a pop-up of the square for about half a year, and it tested how it was going to potentially work as well. And that was an interesting one, because I grew up nearby there, and when I was a kid, that was full of European migrants. Now it's full of Sudanese migrants, Middle Eastern and Asian, very diverse. So it has changed. So this idea that spaces change, they need to change with cohorts as they change. And even when you get diversity of different cohorts, you have to realise that they're all going to want to have some degree of their own spaces in there as well. So that understanding and also that ability to respond here and engage with them is so crucial. I think town teams do that extraordinarily well.
I think something else is definitely building empathy. So a project that I'm working on at the moment, we're working with Centre for Stories. So as part of that, the stories that we're looking for 80% diverse storytellers. So that's people from, CALD communities or gender diverse people and so on and so forth. Because that would be an input into building an understanding of their relationship with their place that's going to build the capacity of everybody else who's part of that engagement process. So I think stories are great like that, and that also taking in the stories from the past, seeing what the stories from the present are now in a diverse way, and then creating what are some stories for the future that are going to allow those future communities to keep developing is kind of a technique for doing that as well.
Back to you, Sandy, I think.
Yeah, I think we're really covering the next lot of questions already through the conversation. It's really the focus on people and communities being heard. But the next question that we spoke about was, what role do local governments and planning authorities play in shaping public spaces, and how do communities make sure their voices are heard in those conversations? Maybe we'll start with Dimity this time.
So I think that in terms of the role that local governments and planning authorities have, I would say that, again, talking with people I think is such an important aspect of it, and making sure to facilitate those conversations. I think often it's had through things like workshops in different communities, but making sure that those workshops are accessible to everyone, so making sure to advertise them in a way that the community people will actually be able to know that they're happening. I think is a really important one, but then also for the community people to be aware of what's happening around them as well in terms of their local area. So if there are flyers that are up, for example, making sure to actually be aware that they're there, and then to participate and go to those workshops to make sure that your voice and your concerns and your desires for the local public space is actually being understood by local governments and stakeholders. I actually ran a few workshops when I was in the Port Hedland for one of the cross-cultural articles that we did with Design for Reconciliation, and it was working with community people to even work out where those flyers should be positioned, whether it's like the local IGA area or something, and then making sure to address all the people that were, following up on it. So I think it's important.
I just want to say, I think local governments are amazing. I think they have a really tough job to do. They're trying to land policies in their communities. I've worked with a lot of local governments. I've probably run over 100 workshops now doing community-led design, and mostly they're trying really hard to get people involved in planning processes. And it's difficult. People are tired. People, it's not on the top of their list. You know, people have complex lives now. They don't have a lot of spare time. So how do we overcome those barriers to participation? That's really crucial. If we can't get people into the room, we're not going to get the information we need. So as well as just participate, there's participation barriers, which are big. And part of the work we do at Fair Place is using really colourful, engaging, scaled, game-like techniques, just to try and reduce that, to make it attractive, to get people in, just to, make it planning attractive to the majority of people. I think there's that participation, but then there's the translation of that, because I think often we can, we're out speaking to people, we're getting great information, but it can stop if it's not translated into the kind of language and policies that we need. So I think part of our role as practitioners is to also translate really well and to make sure that we honour that investment of time that we're given from the community, because it's a very significant and special investment, I think. So
it's not just a tick box that the consultation's done and then put in the bottom drawer and forgotten.
Well, it often is, or it can be, but I think coming up with ways, I think that's why, in the work that I do, we use a lot of physical scaled models so that the data, we can translate that into meaningful spatial information for people to inform policy. So I'm interested in getting communities involved in policy, get at the front end, not just projects, but in having a say on the strategic direction of their areas, because I think that's where we can really embed those kind of community principles at a kind of very strategic level. And that then when the work's done at the next level, we have a really good framework in place which has those values embedded.
Right?
Well, I was going to say, I do share the view that a lot of local governments are trying to do the right thing, and the biggest thing is probably showing some bravery in not succumbing to a very vocal group of vested interests. I remember having to deal in Canning Vale with people who didn't want play equipment installed because then people would play in the park, and that would be, they might be from outside of the estate. I mean, you had people objecting to footpaths being put in, for Christ's sake, because apparently that would bring in the drug dealers. I think they were taking too many drugs of their own. But there is that whole thing of, because again, all of these things sound very true, but when you're hitting this barrage of people who are complaining about, space, we just need to understand that we need to be brave and tolerant for the fact that we're not going to be able to make everyone happy, and that not all spaces can be all things for all people, and that different places will have different functions, but keep to the key philosophy that we should be making it as accessible and as attractive to people as it possibly can be.
And I think getting people to turn up, as you said, it might be a very loud minority and lots of people don't actually contribute to the conversation. But I think Town Team does a great job of actually getting people into the conversation. So
yeah, I'd say for us it's less about having a say and it's more about having a do. Like it's really saying you're not a customer, you're a citizen. So yeah, exactly. And we need to share responsibility for creating public spaces. They belong to all of us. They're too complex. Places are too complex for any one body to do it. And local government can't do it. They can't meet everyone's expectations. But if it's shared responsibility and you've made it easier for people and enabled them, I think you're a long way to solving that almost crisis of place, really, and government, I think.
You're like a broker, in a way. You're sort of between the local government and the community.
We kind of are. In fact, there's even things that we use like a deal. that comes from Wigan in the UK. There can be a deal between the community and the government, and permissions going both ways. You can do this, yes, you can do this if. Yes, you can do this if. Yeah, it needs to evolve much further, I think. And it is.
If I can just add a comment, when I moved to Australia, some people here might remember the Dialogue with the City initiative, which is part of the Network City Plan, and there was one of the largest kind of town hall events as part of that whole planning process down in the old Fremantle passenger terminal, and I was absolutely excited to be going to this to take part in it, because my PhD, I'd just come from London, and my PhD was on participation and stuff, and I wanted to kind of get in on the inside of this as a participant and so forth. And it was a really eye-opening kind of experience for me. And I ended up writing this paper, which is very critical of the process, because for me, and interestingly for two other academics who were doing research independently, which I didn't know about at the time, one at Curtin University and a European professor from Leuven in Belgium, we all came to the same conclusion, basically, that the whole process, despite all the participatory dimensions to it all, it was all state-crafted, basically. It was a stage-managed process. The decision about what the metropolitan region should look like had been made, but the illusion of choice had been presented to people. Here's the four models. Two of them were non-runners, ultimately, but there were two in the middle. So this illusion of choice was, I kind of argued was a kind of false one. And I use that as an example because following on from this, Sandy's question is about the power that exists between different stakeholders that are involved in creating urban spaces. So we do have the state, we have developers, we have local government, and then we have citizens. So I'm just wondering, how would you see the current landscape in terms of where does the power lie in decision making within Western Australia at the moment, basically, and what does that power kind of look like?
Look, I think that, ultimately, I take on board what you're saying, but there are things which are givens in any particular circumstance. And my biggest thing is don't give people the illusion that it's a blank sheet of paper when there are things fixed. So be clear about what is movable. But in terms of that power dynamic, it varies. Like I would say, for instance, a Mount Morley Highgate type environment, you're dealing with far more empowered citizens who are going to be not only comfortable, but very able to articulate their desires and intentions very clearly. When you're out in, the back blocks of Baldivers, the ability to both get genuine feedback, but also the care factor about being involved may not be there. So we also need to accept that it's not compulsory engagement. And some people just want to have, a bloody park with some grass and a playground. Let's not overcomplicate things. And that's where I also think that we need to be mindful that, in terms of those places and spaces, the primary stakeholders will tend to be, one, the local government, but two, the developers nowadays, because as I sort of say, how the space is developed and designed and, how it presents is all part of this estate mentality, and that then is linked to who their market is. Look, that apparently works, but I find that difficult to accept because to me that just reinforces the, which estate do I belong in? Oh, hang on, I fit in this one here. And I just struggle with that, but I do feel that there are market forces and development forces which are creating that.
Look, I would share some of your concerns. I don't think participation necessarily is a panacea anymore, because you can end up in a stalemate situation where nothing can get done, in terms of people resist an idea to do something, and other people might want something to be done to their area. But if the most vocal, the most active kind of campaign against it, I think coming back to the issue of diversity, if you think about young people and the perennial problem of skate parks as a good example, an exemplar of, contested public urbanisms. That's great for young people, but local residents and homeowners often, shriek when those kind of proposals are put forward. And others, like places of worship and other services and facilities which we need in society, in the public interest are needed, but if they're in the wrong location, then people will push back against them. But we really need those services, spaces, places to happen in the city, in order to make it so we have a better society. So, but Peter, were you going to say something there? Yeah.
Yeah, just picking up on, in fact, both of those points. Where does the power lie? In fact, it's probably more accurate, I think, to say where does the shambalism lie, because really the whole process is just shambolic disconnection of activity between political and technical and bureaucratic players. Nobody knows what's going on. But Ray, you picked up a good point that there's a sense, there's a power that developers have when first creating parks and places in greenfield. It used to be that they just had to set aside the land and the local government would upgrade it. Now they're expected to upgrade it. In fact, they like that because they can differentiate themselves. Maybe there's an opportunity to revert back to some of those old principles or those old policy requirements where provide 8%, but 2% remains cash in lieu. Why? Because then the council can come along in 5 years, really gauge with the community what they want, and then do final closeout on those spaces. But I think there's one other thing from a local government perspective. We're discussing on local government, and particularly, and I'm just thinking from spatial design considerations. I've seen over the years this sort of sense of shrinkflation occur with public space. And not because we're giving up less space, we're giving up probably more than we have certainly over the decades. But in what's being given up by developers, there's an increasing component that's being taken for drainage in a different way that it used to. So that's not usable. That's not usable by the public. We're seeing with existing areas or established areas, maybe encroachments by works such as roadworks or other infrastructure. In urban spaces, I'm thinking about places like King's Square, we're even seeing commercial encroachment. So the ability and the power to manage those encroachments and actually, hold the guardianship of the quality of public space, I think, is something that local government really needs to, really see itself as needing to champion.
Thanks, Peter. Ray, quickly.
No, I was just going to say, there is a distinct, given that you put the sub in suburban, because the urban spaces, again, I think the City of Perth has the hardest challenge because its stakeholders aren't just people who live here, because this space belongs to a whole greater range of people.
Well, suburbanites who come in here to work every day, they see it as their space as well. It's not just ratepayers, and the civic facilities that exist here are for the benefit of the whole metropolitan region, the whole of the state, essentially. So the State Theatre, the conference centre, the PCEC, the cockroach or whatever you want to call it. They serve much wider areas, basically. So ownership and power, can be distributed across, but where it can be also concentrated in various ways as well. Sandy, back to you, or do we want to go out to the audience or ask a question on this side and this side? What do you think?
Yeah, I think maybe just one more question.
Okay, if
that's okay. Because I thought this was a good one because, in the end, it keeps, with all the answers, it keeps coming back to people and the experience of people in places, and the exhibition that we've got at the Hub space, if you've had a look. Interestingly, when I walked around today, I know all the projects and they're normally all filled with people, but in the photos taken by the architects or the architecture photographers, they're all devoid of people, which is interesting. But how do we make better spaces to encourage public interaction? When we've got increasingly people working from home and more isolated, how do we better design spaces to encourage social interaction and people coming together? Anthony?
I think Ray's points about just getting the basics right is really relevant. So making spaces comfortable, legible, really clear principles. I don't think we can make people come together. We can provide the context for that to happen. But there are so many other factors around people's lives which may interrupt that. So I don't think we have to be careful we don't try and design interaction, like get into too much social engineering, because we end up kind of making, I heard Aaron Betsky speak about this. He says, the tragedy of design is it can make tombs for social relations. So we end up creating these environments which are monofunctional or don't. So I think having adaptable spaces, and I really like what you said, Ray, was also about spaces that evolve over time. And we don't try and over-program them too quickly. We let people inhabit them and come to them.
Emma?
Yeah, I think being responsive, find out which spaces people want to use and how they want to use them, and design it and ideally co-create it with them, because the chances are they will use it because it's fit for purpose. And you won't just finish a design and hand it over and hope for the best. It'll be ready for them.
Peter?
Probably, again, just going back to that list that I spoke to, which is not a design by numbers. It's just really reminders, did we think about this? Did we think about that? Because it's being holistic and designing in the round and thinking in the round that's going to make sure that you've got spaces that are meaningful for people, and ensuring along that journey that it's the constant theme of just continually engaging and continually bringing in an understanding of people's needs in that space.
Dimity?
I think, building on everything that has already been said, thinking about who isn't being designed for as well currently. There's a big gap in the built environment with designing with First Nations people. There's a big gap. I did a study a few years ago that looked at how many papers exist related to built environment people collaborating with First Nations people, and there was, out of 4,231 abstracts, there was only 3. So there's a massive gap. So I think focusing on, as much as possible, reconciliation with First Nation groups as well in those spaces is pretty important.
Did your work do that? Was that part of your work? To just
Yeah.
sort of go out there and do that sort of work?
Yeah, so I've been up to the Pilbara a few times working with First Nation groups there, and then in Perth as well specifically. But yeah, some of the conversations that I've had up north, we've been looking at designing a pilot framework for rural residential outcomes, and also a pilot toolbox for First Nation elder care across the Pilbara. And some of those conversations have been so powerful, because I've had a few elders say to me that no one's ever asked me what type of housing I want, or what type of in-between spaces between the housing. So yeah, there's a big gap. So I think recognising as well who isn't being included in the standard approach, I guess, to designing public spaces is really critical.
Yeah, I share that view. There's also those who, of course, don't want to be social. I mean, teenagers as a general rule, teenage boys especially, which is why the skate parks need to be tucked around the back. But I think also if we spent 20% less on the infrastructure and directed that towards actually putting on events to actually get people to interact, not forcing them, but like if you actually, they've been, and again, I think town teams have got a great heritage in this, in terms of having events which get people together and create those connections, which then all of a sudden, you're bumping into that person down the road and that sort of stuff. And we do run the risk of losing that sense of community. And if we don't have that sense of community, then what's the point?
Thanks, everyone. Shall we go to questions from the floor now?
So Sandy and I are going to come down and mingle with you for a little bit, okay? But I think we've got time for probably one question each, one from this side of the room. So Sandy's going to deal with this side. So if somebody on that side of the room has got a question, if you want to raise your hand, and then Sandy will come to the mic, and then you can pose it to the panel. And is there anybody on this side, I'm going to come to you and you can ask a question. So You want to get your hand up quickly? Okay, I see a hand there. Hold it up there. And I know I'll come down to you. So, Sandy, you want to ask first?
Thank you. So the engineer in the room and a traffic engineer, I'm going to bring up the elephant in the room. Access, you spoke about access for a range of people. I've been in Perth for nearly 30 years now. Where are we going to get the integrated planning and transport correct so that when we're looking at these spaces, we actually have cycle paths, connections, public transport, and get over our reliance on the car, such that we can enjoy these places and people actually have universal access to be able to get to them, not park 300 metres away and have to walk.
They're all looking at each other.
Yeah, I don't think that there can be a date provided as such. I do think that there has been improvements, but my experience is part of it is you have different agencies advocating for different user groups, and I find the Lycra Nazis, requiring their bike lane to have no intrusion. Like, there are spaces that need to be shared, and so there needs to be that cultural shift. So I think we can, again, the public transport component, that I think we're doing a lot of good things, but we perhaps need to get better of, not thinking that it's all about me and how I choose to get there, that we need to actually have, particularly in those town centres, spaces where cars, pedestrians, cyclists all have to moderate their behaviour. And coming from Dutch heritage, they haven't got it right yet, because if you go into that bike lane, they'll take you out.
Anyone else from the panel? Emma?
Sorry, the question was, why can't we get to them? Is that...
Integrated transport and land use planning.
All the things you need to think about. I think one of the things that gets forgotten is how are people going to get there. So the locals, when we studied Heathcote, for example, it was so popular that people were parking a kilometre away because it actually was a a state destination. We did all postcodes. So as a traffic engineer, we went and we looked at who was coming, and it was a state destination. And yet look at all the little streets around Heathcote where the residents didn't want you to park.
But that's because it's everyone's driving. Yeah. So I would say alternative modes of transport would be encouraged, should be encouraged for that. I mean, I don't think we should be able to park everywhere. So there's a bit of carrot and stick with that kind of stuff, isn't it? So it's really hard to get to. We'll hopefully enforce some behaviour change.
Perhaps one of the ways in which we can bring transport or integrated transport planning out of the silo is maybe put it through some other processes. I mean, what are the thoughts? What are the thoughts about being able to call in transport projects into state design review panels? And actually pull them apart from a design perspective, not just simply to say, look, from an engineering perspective, you've said you have to deliver X, Y, and Z, and we just have to take it. Actually go through a process of nuanced interrogation and compromise and change.
I find it baffling that we don't have enough space for our transport in this city. Yeah. How can we not have enough space? It's the size of the city, the density of the city, and I think everyone has to have their own individual area.
Yes, I agree, and the same with what Ray was saying. I think it's about maturing a bit and sharing spaces, and cars having to slow down and enable other people to use those streets as well. I think it's partly cultural, and demonstrating that more.
I think it's the victim of success. So I think about Scarborough, for example. It's an attractive space and everybody wants to go to it. And unfortunately, at the moment, accessibility by public transport is pretty weak, but everybody wants to drive there. You're carting your kids, your surfboard, your boogie boards, and everything else. The cars that, at the moment is the easiest and best way of doing it. So until we can resolve that, so I think there's a kind of a victim of success with really popular public urban spaces or suburban spaces. Because if everybody wants to get to them, if they're, as you said, a state destination, then I think there is the big dilemma from the get-go. If it does become a popular space, I just think I'll come back to the urban surf park that's going to be built in Coburn, so you can see where my brain's at. That's going to be really interesting in terms of, as a state destination and how popular that's going to be. I mean, obviously it's on a freeway, but there's a train there. I'd be really interested to see how many surfers are going to get on the train with their surfboards. Is that an attractive proposition? Will the rules and regulations allow them to do that? Because we know with cyclists, for example, I think we've got a very restrictive approach here in terms of the times. If you're a cyclist, you want to bring your bike on. If you're European, you just walk your bike onto the train or put it onto the front of the bus and you just go. It's integrated culturally in policy senses, but I think we have these kind of rather outdated kind of policies and rules about how we use things. So, but we have a question here. If you say who you are.
Hello, I'm Katie Lehnan. So Paul, you mentioned skate parks, which I don't know much about, but I know, they don't take up that much room. Another thing I don't know anything about, but has just been on my mind lately, I don't know why, and that's golf courses. And you think they take up a lot of space and they're exclusive in terms of who can go to play golf, and they're excluding in terms of who can use that space. And I'm also scared of low-flying golf balls, but I don't know if people can access a golf course to not play golf. And what does everybody think about that?
Well, I do know, just quickly, in Melbourne during COVID, remember that? Golf courses became public parks. So there was, a disaster provoked a policy and a cultural change, and golf courses were used as public parks, basically. So in times of crisis, weird things can happen, but they are exclusive space. They are seen as an exclusive space. But they're also very useful in environmental terms. I had some students doing a presentation today looking at urban heat island effects, and they did this mapping to show kind of, where temperatures were high and low. And in golf courses and suburbs, they help bring down the temperature. So they do have a kind of social benefit to them as well, despite being exclusionary spaces. I'm not a golfer, by the way. So, but what about the panel? Any golfers?
No golfers.
Anti-golfers?
But anecdotally, I did actually, with my daughter, paint a mural in a golf course only a couple of months ago. But that was the Mount Lawley golf course. And one interesting thing that I learnt there was, now I've got the numbers completely wrong, but I'll kind of just freeball it. Let's say the total golf course was about 50 hectares, about 18 hectares was fundamentally just pure conservation. And the volunteers were going through really doing an incredible amount of restoration. They were planting something like 30 or 40,000, trees, understory and all of that sort of thing. Something that the local government didn't need to actually fork out to do. So it was a way in which at least they played an environmental role.
I think my dad would hate me for saying this, but if you asked what a golf course should be in the city, it probably shouldn't be a golf course. We shouldn't be throwing water onto turf. It should be rewilded. It should be a natural environment. It should be regenerated to provide a habitat and all the kind of environmental benefits. So I don't know how you could argue against that.
Well, but I would draw the distinction between a private golf course and a public golf course, and there is a distinction. One is privately owned land, and how they choose to use it. Of the alternatives, I'm okay with it. I do sometimes question when you have large swathes of public land with a big fence around it saying, unless you're a member, bugger off. I do have a bit of an issue. Perhaps it was less of an issue in previous times when perhaps those spaces weren't as valued. But it's also then, what are you prepared to pay? That being said, one of the big contentious issues that is occurring in various locations is golf courses shutting down because consumer trends have changed. And so some of those private golf courses are shutting down, and particularly where it's a golf course estate, and I can't remember the one down in Jandakot, near your surf park. The residents are freaking out because they're going, we're bought into a golf estate, you can't take half the golf course away. And I think the Vines is the other one, which is... there is that tension point, but I do take the point that having large swathes of land, which is publicly held land, which is leased at $1 or some token amount a year, probably there does need to be some questions as to whether that's providing best value, or there needs to be some level of obligation for public access.
Yeah. It's just a comment really, and now two comments. But one, I was thinking of Boola Park down in Freo. So that really is an extension of that Fremantle golf course, I feel. And that is so inclusive, so welcoming to community that I think that's a nice thing, you know, and a big space. But another thought as well, just because of what Ray's just said, but golf courses are really special in Australia. You know, you go to other countries and you pay an astronomical amount to go play golf. They're smaller spaces, they're really special, they're exclusive. We are more welcoming in Australia, and it is creating that space that should be at the middle of a community.
We can debate that over wine.
Just on your comment, Ray, about public and private, I mean, one of the spaces that I think could be utilised more in terms of public urbanisms and suburbanisms are schools, public schools. So a lot of the spaces around public schools are closed off after 3:30, for example, and you know, if they've got sporting facilities, and I think they should be, I mean, by definition, they're public schools, right? So we should be able to use them, you know, the parents and kids who aren't going to those schools and so forth. But often, again, rules and regulations around risk and insurance often inhibit, you know, this accessibility to those types of public spaces. So until we can culturally and politically get over those ideas and those concerns, you know, we don't really have true public with a capital P spaces. Sandy, sorry, I'm going to go back to you, Sandy.
Oh, have we got more time for questions? Or
Yeah, let's have one more on your side there. Yeah.
Listening to everything that has been said, and my question is not about challenging co-design and everything, but when you really consult with people, part of that needs to be educating them of what is possible. So what is actually the role of innovation, of disruption, of vision for you in your roles, in that consultation and in the creation of the spaces?
That's an easy one, right? Thanks for that, it's a good one.
Did you want to go first?
I'll go first, yeah. One of the techniques that we've often used is something that is sometimes been called charrette, sometimes been called planning design forums or place design forums. And what that often is a multi-day process of engaging with stakeholders, designing, it's a kind of call and response. So you get this ongoing day after day process of hearing what issues they are, hearing what desires and aspirations are, kind of responding, you know, because people don't clearly express themselves always in terms of what they want to see in a place. So that's where, you know, like all of those things I was speaking about before, that's when the designer needs to kick in and go, okay, maybe some of this, do we do that? That could work well. What do you think? You know, that sort of process we've found it actually works quite well. It is costly though, because it has to run over multiple times.
Like just as an example, when we started to have technological disruption, right? And we had share riding coming in, yeah? And one of the things talking to people with disabilities used to have to sit in front of shopping centres for up to 4 hours waiting for a taxi to arrive. So share riding did cut that down, but there was a side effect. Not only if they had to wait, they could now watch where their ride was. So they could actually go back into the shopping centre and spend valuable time rather than sitting out in the rain and the sun. I don't think anybody thought of that kind of side effect when we introduced the share riding technology. But this is where I'm like, we don't know what we don't know, and we need people to disrupt. We need people to have different visions. And sorry, the person from the street, for me to know what I might be able to expect of a design aspect or of a public space when nobody shows me what is possible.
I think that's the role of prototyping, isn't it, as well? You know, try, keep refining it, keep testing it. It doesn't matter if it's wrong, or maybe you discover something and just take that iterative prototyping approach. Absolutely,
I think that, and there will be changes that we can't predict, and we can't predict, as you say. There is definitely a role for technology. I mean, I've seen, like, in terms of the VR sort of headsets where people can actually see what the space would look like and things like that. The application of that and how that can be used is going to be significant. But one is the role in terms of the tools that are available. The other is the level of interest and investment that people are also prepared to give. And as I sort of say, you look at volunteerism, you look at people's time is valuable and where they choose to put it. So also making sure that you're getting a proper cross-section. It is an expensive process. I'm not saying it's not worth it, but that's always the competing interest.
I think as well, recognising the difference between consultation and engagement. In many ways, consultation kind of implies one conversation or one interaction, whilst engagement is coming back and talking over time and over multiple visits with people. So I think that's really important, because when we engage with people, and with my experience engaging with First Nations people, we can start to understand over time, one, what's possible from a design point of view, but also what we've, as designers, have misinterpreted as well from what community people want, and also what is meaningful and relevant to them too. So it's approaching it in partnership, which is why I think co-production is so important, because it's not just the designing, but it's the decision making, and after it's all finished, going back and saying, was that a good process? Did we fulfil the needs and requirements of community people at an individual scale and then as a collective? So I think engagement is really important over time.
Just quickly on the disruptive side of things. So Nicole and I and a bunch of other colleagues, we have a book actually called Disruptive Urbanisms, where we were looking at the sharing economy and platform economies. And, if you think, and Nicole's done extensive work around Airbnb. So if you think of Airbnb as a phenomena, as a disruptive phenomena that's happened, it's got positive dimensions to it in the sense of vacation and for income generation for those who are in the housing market and have got surplus housing and can rent out the housing into that market. But the downside or the dark side of it is that what it does, the negative impacts that it has on the real housing market, basically, and what it does for people looking to rent for long terms. From a consumer perspective, it's great for those of us that have the money. It extends our choice massively, in terms of where we can go. It's a home away from home, basically, if you get another house. So there are lots of complexities here, and in terms of what happens and where those disruptors are coming from. Is it from the market, the tech bros, or whatever, basically? So there are ups and downs to all of this. I don't think there's any kind of perfection. COVID was a massive disruptor. We saw massive displacement of activity around metropolitan Australia, where the urban core was hollowed out, and the suburbs became the place where all the action was, because we were all working from home, and people rediscovered the suburbs. And for those of us, if you're in Melbourne and Sydney, coffee shops and all these other spaces opened up. Anybody that remembers here in Hyde Park, Choose Cafe on Hyde Park, the queues that used to be around it during COVID were phenomenal, because people refined this inner suburban space. So disruption, is a kind of a two-edged kind of phenomenon in terms of the outcomes and the outputs that it creates. But I think it's a really smart question. So thanks for that. So, okay, so we're going to wrap up, because we're going to socialize, and you can natter with the panelists and everything. and you want wine. So, and you can wine at Ray some of his questions and responses if you want to. So, look, just want to thank all of you for coming out tonight and showing your interest in coming along to the Festival of Urbanism Perth. I want to thank the WA Museum for this amazing space. When I came earlier in the year looking for somewhere to host this event, there was no chairs in it, but I could just imagine what it was going to look like. And it's got an amazing backdrop out into the city here as we were looking out into public urbanism proper. We're in a public urban space with the museum. So thanks to the museum. Thanks to Sandy and Perth Design Week for partnering with the Public Policy Institute. Big thanks to Nicole for her continued support and sort of branching out from Sydney to Melbourne and now all the way over here to the west. So we'll be thinking about what we do next year. Maybe we do something, we just had a panel last year. We have a panel and an exhibition. So God knows what we'll think about for next year, Sandy. Do something else. Co-design something, yeah. Well, there is co-design.
We can workshop it now.
This was co-designed. And then, of course, all the panelists as well. So thank you very much. And I have a little gift for each of you to give in a second, but I just want to kind of plug a couple of things. So I think you've all been to the photo exhibition. If you can spread the word about that, that would be great. Do it on the socials or whatever, be disruptive. We've got the Public Policy Institute's got a couple of other events coming up. Tomorrow night we have a pretty big event looking at the Voice referendum, like 1 year on, and kind of reflecting on the major kind of policy and political implications of that, which is being held at UWA. And it's a free event. You'll find it on our webpage and our LinkedIn page. And at the end of the month, we've got an event looking at future generations and young people, not now for the long term. So we've got Fiona Stanley and another expert panel of speakers coming to that. And you can subscribe to our newsletter on LinkedIn and so forth. And before we go to drinks, I've got to go behind the screen. So I'll be talking from behind here. This is interesting. So, as a token of our appreciation, we'd just like to give you this little book from. There is wine as well. So we were lucky earlier this year to have Michael Sheldrake from globalcitizen.org here in Perth, and we bought a bunch of his books, and the book's called From Ideas to Impact, and it gives you a really interesting insight about how to do positive policy and political engagement, basically. And Michael works at very large scales and working with various government organizations and NGOs around the world. So thank you very much, panel, and we will adjourn for drinks, which are at the opposite end of this floor. So thank you very much.